Hey guys, this is Dr. Matt Winning at winningstrength.com. And the topic today is very interesting. It's kind of when did anabolics start? When did what we would consider cheating today start? And how far back did it really go? And as I dug into more of my books and my research, I started to find that it went back a lot farther than we thought. My initial thought process was that the Nazis developed it around 1936 to increase soldier aggression. But what I found is that cheating has been going on since the beginning of humanity. If we look at Prokop in 1970 wrote a book about how they had wrote the cheaters' names on the walls on the first Olympic Games stadium, and people's even their family names would be on there, either due to bribery or whatever. And people would try to use special diets back then, like dried figs or only meat. So the carnivore diet for performance enhancing positioning goes back a lot farther than just like 10 years ago, right? In medieval times, people started to learn the ability of anabolics and androgenic function because of the testicles. So when they observed the effects of castration on domesticated animals, they started to realize if they left the animals not castrated, they were much more aggressive, had much more muscle mass, and much more stamina. And if they did get castrated, then they were much more low-key, very less susceptible to being angry, had better manners in the farm, right? But as early as 1400 BC, the Sostra of India advocated think about this, the ingestion of testicle tissue to cure impotence, as well as the Egyptians stated that medical powers to the testes. So this is like 3,000 years ago, and people of India and Egypt are understanding the importance of testicular tissue. They're just not understanding that you probably eat it and it's not necessarily going to have the same effects. But that was actually in a book in 1995 by Hoberman and Yasalis. Now, the first actual use of anabolics is really interesting because from my former reading, I thought it was the Nazis. Now, the Nazis might have been the first German people to actually develop anabolic steroids. There was a 72-year-old physiologist, neurologist, and he self-administered subcutaneous injections of, listen to this, testicular blood, semen, and testicular juice from dogs or guinea pigs in 1889. The crazy part about that is that actually made him put him in the map as the father of modern endocrinology. What balls does this guy have, right? But this became a mass of scientific experiments. His first little bit of doing these, what I would call completely outlandish injections, started to lead down the path of scientists and the general public starting to get a little bit more awareness of maybe there is a magic drug, and maybe this magic drug could help me with all kinds of stuff like infertility, performance enhancement, anti-aging, right? So in 1912, there was something called glandular therapy where they would actually transplant animal testicular material to the human body in the hopes that they would get more vitality and more testosterone. This was later, in about 20 years after that, was proven to not really work and to be obviously dangerous, right? You're going to look at massive infections. But in 1935, so this is where my knowledge started, was the first isolated testosterone, and after that, injections and pills were available. Rumors started to be circulated around the Nazis using it in the 36 Olympics and during World War II. So this was actually referenced by a person named Wade in 1972. By 1940, we start to see studies confirming its improvement in normal men and women. So this is really interesting because if we look at it from a normal person's perspective, what we start to realize is that steroids and anabolic performance due to external factors may have been prevalent way before. You know, I remember my grandfather telling me how badass like Babe Ruth was, or Willie Mays, or a lot of these older school guys, these baseball guys, or even some of the old time lifters. Ken Patera is an example. You know, you look at guys like that, Paul Anderson, and you start wondering, like, is that kind of, are they still drug free or were they not drug free? And the answer is, who knows? But there has been statements of Ken Patera saying that, he was stronger than Alexiev, and then 3 years later, he's weaker than Alexiev. And I think some of that may have to do with the training protocols. I think the Russians were training obviously way smarter than we know now from all the Soviet manuals, but the anabolics were still there. And again, stepping forward into this video a little bit longer, I think that they're still there now. They're just done in a smarter way. But about 1954 is where we see this big transition. The Soviets tell the American coaches that their athletes are taking anabolic steroids. So a guy by the name of Dr. John Ziegler, the Team US physician for the Team USA, goes back and experiments on his athletes. And 1958 was a big, different kind of split. Is that 1958, it was the introduction of D-bol. So methoandrostenedione alone. And that drug, everybody that's ever looked at steroids, I know right now the hot topic is trenbolone, but back in the 50s and all the way up until 10 or 15 years ago, D-bol was considered the drug of choice for males for oral usage. And it's interesting that it's been out since the 50s. So we're talking 70 years now. By the 60s, it started to become known and utilized in sports in the USA beyond lifting and bodybuilding. So what you start seeing in the 60s is you start seeing any athlete that can have more power, more energy. They start to realize that it's not just for bulky weightlifters, that this can be used for running, jumping, sprinting, rowing, anything of that nature, even swimming. So in 1968, a guy named Dr. Tom Waddle said that 1/3 of the U.S. track and field team had used steroids. So again, we talk about all the time on how bad the Russians were about using steroids way before us. Well, if we look at this right now, we realize that that's not really true. The Russians probably had a little bit of an edge of using anabolics in the 50s. But by the 60s, if we go by Dr. Tom Waddle, we already realized that 33% of the U.S. track and field team, not just weightlifting, but the U.S. track and field team had used steroids. Once we get into the late 70s and early 80s, we start to see another kind of jump in performance from growth hormone. Now, the books will tell you that growth hormone was originally synthesized around the mid-80s. And, it was originally utilized for people with dwarfism, developmental issues. But before that, I remember Louis Simmons telling me a story in the mid-late 70s. They came across a batch of Remus monkey hormone, HGH, where they would actually take the pituitary gland out of the monkey, withdraw the fluids from it, and then they would actually inject it. And I remember Louis telling me that he could see his abs in like 2 weeks from using this Remus monkey hormone. Obviously, back then, nobody knew about HIV. Nobody knew about blood, transmitted diseases. I'm sure there were a handful of people that got some pretty wicked shit from doing that. But, think about growth hormones been readily available to athletes if they did it the veterinarian way since the 70s. But now since the 80s and the 90s and then above, growth hormone could be utilized or can be utilized or is utilized in sports now. I think the interesting topic that we have to come to conclusions is that how far are you willing to go? Obviously, everybody can improve with training smarter. Everybody can improve with increasing longevity of training, right? So if we're getting, more years out of our training with better results, sometimes for a lot of people, especially the general public, as strong as they can get naturally, if they do it right, is probably far more than they think that they can do. But if you're trying to break all-time world records, or you're trying to be the best in the world at what you do, I don't think that the playing field, especially in the last 70 years, has made it to where it's possible without drugs. One of the biggest areas that I think that people don't want to talk about is that if you do research, you'll realize that in sporting activity, stimulants have caused way more deaths than anabolic steroids on average. Meaning that, if you look at a lot of the old-time cyclists and a lot of the other Olympians that have died of these massive heart attacks, and even NFL or NBA players, cocaine, other types of stimulants can be a huge issue with those types of things. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that stimulants has probably killed more athletes than anabolic steroids ever will. So it's interesting that, the anabolics get such a bad rap on this stuff. So again, I think this is really interesting for me. One day I'll get a little bit better at shooting these YouTube videos where I can put in more B-roll stuff and things like that. But for me, I think that this is a very interesting topic because I think that this goes back a lot farther than we think it does, and I think that that it's so fascinating to me that this stuff has been around much longer than we thought. So hopefully you guys liked this video. If you did, like and subscribe, leave some comments down below. And I'll try to shoot some more videos like this in the future. So talk to you guys soon.